It's 11 p.m. on June 7th, 2017, and the Weis supermarket in Eaton Township, Pennsylvania is beginning its quiet overnight shift. The fluorescent lights hum softly over empty aisles as a small crew of workers begins the routine tasks of restocking shelves, cleaning floors, and preparing for another day of serving the local community. Among the night shift workers is 24-year-old Randy Stair, a part-time employee who has worked at this store for several years while pursuing his passion for creating animated content on YouTube. To his co-workers, Randy seems like a quiet, somewhat odd young man who keeps to himself but generally causes no trouble during his shifts. But what his colleagues don't know is that Randy has spent months planning to transform their workplace into a crime scene. In his increasingly delusional mind, he believes that committing murder will allow him to join fictional cartoon characters in an imaginary afterlife where he can live as his true self. Keep this image of an ordinary supermarket night shift in mind as we explore this story, because what happens over the next hour will demonstrate how dangerous it can be when untreated mental illness combines with access to weapons and an online echo chamber that reinforces delusions rather than challenging them. The case of Randy Stair represents not just a workplace shooting, but a cautionary tale about the warning signs of violence that were documented extensively online, but never properly addressed by mental health intervention. Randy Robert Stair was born on September 17, 1992 in Dallas Township, Pennsylvania, into what appeared to be a typical American middle-class family. His parents, Robert and Lorianne, welcomed a second son, Jeremy, 2 years later, completing what seemed like a conventional family unit focused on raising their children in a stable suburban environment. Pennsylvania in the early 1990s was experiencing the cultural shifts that characterized much of suburban America, the rise of cable television, early internet adoption, and the expansion of media options that allowed children to retreat into entertainment rather than engaging with their immediate communities. These technological changes would prove significant for Randy's development. From early childhood, Randy displayed personality traits that would become more pronounced and problematic as he aged. He was extremely shy and introverted, preferring solitude to social interaction and showing discomfort when he became the center of attention. Unlike typical childhood shyness that children often outgrow through social development, Randy's isolation seemed to deepen over time. Teachers at his elementary school noted that Randy would often look away during conversations and seemed uncomfortable with normal classroom interactions. He preferred individual activities to group projects and would become visibly anxious when required to present work or participate in class discussions. His childhood interests centered around animated television shows, particularly those produced by Nickelodeon. He would spend hours drawing characters like Timmy Turner from The Fairly Odd Parents and Danny Fenton from Danny Phantom, often filling school notebooks with these cartoon figures instead of focusing on academic work. Randy's fascination with animation represented more than typical childhood entertainment consumption. He seemed to identify more strongly with cartoon characters than with real people, suggesting an early disconnection from reality that would become more severe as he aged. His drawings were detailed and obsessive, showing a level of emotional investment in fictional characters that exceeded normal childhood interests. Think of Randy's childhood development like a plant that fails to receive adequate sunlight. Instead of growing toward natural light sources like social interaction and real-world engagement, he turned inward and began to wither in ways that weren't immediately obvious to observers. The Stair family dynamics also contributed to Randy's isolation. His father, Robert, worked long hours managing the supermarket and expected his sons to develop independence and work ethic. His mother, Lorianne, was supportive but seemed unable to recognize the severity of Randy's social difficulties or the need for professional intervention. During his school years at Dallas High School, Randy's social isolation became more pronounced. While he had acquaintances and could function in group settings when required, he never developed close friendships or romantic relationships that might have provided reality checks for his increasingly distorted thinking. His academic performance was adequate but unremarkable, as Randy put minimal effort into studies that didn't relate to his entertainment interests. Teachers described him as quiet and compliant, but noted that he seemed disconnected from typical teenage concerns like sports, dating, or future career planning. In June 2008, at age 15, Randy launched his YouTube channel called Pioneers Productions, marking the beginning of a digital life that would eventually consume his identity entirely. Initially, the channel featured typical teenage content, comedy skits, movie clip compilations, and amateur filmmaking that reflected a normal interest in creative expression. The early 2000s represented a unique period in internet history when platforms like YouTube were democratizing content creation and giving ordinary people opportunities to build audiences and express creativity. For someone like Randy, who struggled with face-to-face social interaction, these platforms seemed to offer an alternative path to connection and validation. Randy created recurring characters for his videos, including Froggy, a stuffed animal he claimed to have rescued from a shopping cart, and Whale, a character he voiced with disturbing sexual themes. These characters allowed Randy to express aspects of his personality and interest that he couldn't share in face-to-face interactions with real people. The creation of these characters reveals Randy's sophisticated understanding of narrative and character development, skills that could have been channeled toward legitimate creative careers if his psychological problems hadn't interfered with his ability to distinguish between fiction and reality. The YouTube channel provided Randy with something he had never experienced before: positive feedback and validation from an audience. Comments, views, and subscribers gave him a sense of achievement and connection that was missing from his offline life. Early viewers praised his creativity and humor, reinforcing his belief that his online identity was more valuable than his real-world self. But this digital validation came with dangerous side effects. Rather than using his online success as a stepping stone toward real-world social development, Randy began to prefer his digital identity to his physical existence. The boundary between his online persona and his actual self began to blur in ways that would prove psychologically destructive. Randy's parents initially viewed his YouTube channel as a healthy hobby that kept him occupied and provided creative outlets. They didn't understand the extent to which he was using online activities to avoid dealing with real-world challenges like making friends, dating, or developing practical life skills. The comments section of Randy's early videos reveals a small but dedicated audience of viewers who appreciated his humor and creativity. These early supporters had no way of knowing that they were feeding an addiction to digital validation that would eventually contribute to Randy's complete disconnection from reality. In 2011, Randy became a YouTube partner, meaning he could earn money from his content creation. This achievement reinforced his belief that his digital life was more valuable and meaningful than his physical existence, creating incentives to spend even more time in online environments rather than developing real-world skills and relationships. The monetization of his content transformed Randy's hobby into what he perceived as a legitimate career, even though his earnings were minimal and inconsistent. This shift made him more resistant to his parents' suggestions that he focus on traditional employment and education as foundations for his future. Randy's psychological decline accelerated dramatically when he discovered the character Ember McLean from the animated series Danny Phantom. Ember was a minor character, a ghost rock star who appeared in only a few episodes, but her impact on Randy's mental state would prove catastrophic. Randy claimed that seeing Ember was a life-changing moment that created an instant spiritual connection. He described feeling that she understood him in ways that no real person ever had, and he began to believe that their relationship transcended the normal boundaries between fiction and reality. This obsession with Ember represents a critical point where Randy's mental health problems shifted from social anxiety and isolation to active delusions about the nature of reality. Rather than recognizing Ember as a fictional character created for entertainment, Randy began to believe she was a real entity who existed in another dimension and was communicating with him. The psychological mechanism behind Randy's attachment to Ember reveals how fictional characters can become surrogate relationships for people who struggle with real-world social connections. Fictional characters are safe because they can't reject you, judge you, or make demands that require personal growth or change. Randy began creating elaborate theories about how he had known Ember in a previous existence before being born as a human. He claimed that his current life was temporary, and that his true destiny was to die and be reunited with her in the afterlife as his authentic self. Randy's fixation on Ember intensified following a series of traumatic events in 2013. He lost a friend in a car accident, experienced the death of his grandfather, suffered property damage from a basement flood, and was involved in a car accident himself. Rather than processing these losses through normal grief mechanisms or seeking professional support, Randy turned to his fantasy relationship with Ember as a coping strategy. The timing of these traumatic events during Randy's early 20s, a crucial period for psychological development and identity formation, meant that his maladaptive coping strategies became deeply ingrained, rather than being addressed through appropriate intervention. Randy's family and friends noticed his increasing obsession with the cartoon character, but dismissed it as harmless fan behavior rather than recognizing it as a symptom of serious psychological problems. His parents were more concerned with practical issues like his employment and education than with understanding the extent of his disconnection from reality. This pattern is like using a tourniquet to treat a headache. The intervention is not only inappropriate for the problem, but actually creates additional damage by cutting off circulation to healthy tissue. Randy's retreat into fantasy provided temporary relief from emotional pain, but prevented him from developing the psychological resources necessary to cope with real-world challenges. Randy's response to real-world stress was to retreat deeper into fantasy, creating an elaborate fictional universe called Ember's Ghost Squad, EGS, that became the focus of his life and creative energy. This wasn't casual fan fiction or normal fandom participation. It was a comprehensive alternate reality that Randy began to believe was more real and important than his actual existence. The EGS universe featured Ember as the leader of a group of ghosts who recruited suicidal people to join their ranks in the afterlife. Randy cast himself as a character in this universe, but significantly, he imagined himself transformed into a female ghost rather than remaining his actual identity. This gender transformation element reveals Randy's deep dissatisfaction with his own identity and circumstances. Rather than working to improve his real life or seeking therapy to address his psychological problems, he was constructing an elaborate fantasy where he could escape from being himself entirely. Randy spent thousands of dollars and countless hours creating animated content for the EGS universe, teaching himself animation software and hiring voice actors to bring his fantasies to life. But his content never attracted the audience he hoped for, leading to frustration and resentment that began to target the real world that was preventing him from achieving his creative goals. The failure of his EGS content to gain popularity created a dangerous psychological dynamic where Randy began to blame external factors for his lack of success, rather than recognizing that his content was too bizarre and disturbing for mainstream audiences. While Randy was spending most of his mental energy on his fantasy universe, he still needed to maintain employment to support himself and his creative projects. In 2010, he briefly worked at McDonald's, but quit after just 3 hours, demonstrating his inability to cope with normal workplace expectations and social interactions. His father, Robert, who was a manager at the local Weis supermarket, arranged for Randy to work at the store in a part-time capacity. This job provided Randy with income and a degree of independence while accommodating his psychological limitations and obsessive focus on his animation projects. Randy's co-workers at Weis described him as quiet, strange, but generally harmless. He preferred to work night shifts when there were fewer people around, and he often seemed lost in his own thoughts rather than engaged with his surroundings. But Randy's relationship with work was complicated by his belief that normal employment was beneath him and interfering with his true calling as an animator. He resented having to spend time on mundane tasks when he believed he should be creating content for his fantasy universe. This resentment was compounded by his father's expectations that Randy should work more hours and eventually become financially independent. These normal parental expectations felt like persecution to Randy, who believed that his family didn't understand or support his creative genius. The workplace became a symbol of everything Randy hated about the real world: routine responsibilities, social expectations, and the need to function in reality rather than retreating into fantasy. Throughout 2016 and early 2017, Randy's online content became increasingly dark and disturbing, featuring themes of violence, death, and revenge against people who didn't understand or appreciate his work. His videos began to include ominous statements about his future plans and philosophical discussions about the nature of death and suicide. Randy created social media profiles for his fictional EGS characters and maintained conversations between them, essentially talking to himself across multiple accounts, while pretending that his imaginary friends were real entities providing him with guidance and support. He began expressing admiration for the Columbine shooters, viewing them as misunderstood victims rather than perpetrators of mass murder. This identification with school shooters represented a crucial escalation in Randy's psychological deterioration, as he began to see violence as a legitimate response to feeling rejected or misunderstood. Randy purchased firearms, including shotguns of the same type used in the Columbine massacre, and began practicing at shooting ranges while creating content that documented his weapons training. He named his guns after his fictional characters, further blurring the line between his fantasy world and real-world violence. Perhaps most disturbing of all, Randy began creating what he called suicide tapes, hours of recorded content where he discussed his plans to commit murder-suicide at his workplace. These recordings were uploaded to file-sharing websites where they remained available for anyone to discover. Think of these warning signs like smoke detectors going off throughout a building. Individually, they might be dismissed as false alarms, but collectively they indicated a dangerous fire that was building toward an explosion. In April 2017, Randy created one of the most chilling pieces of evidence in his case, a video of himself flipping a coin to determine whether he would commit suicide alone or take other people with him. The coin flip decided that his death would involve killing co-workers, a decision he claimed was determined by fate rather than his own choice. This coin flip represents Randy's complete abandonment of moral responsibility and his retreat into magical thinking about destiny and predetermined outcomes. Rather than recognizing that he was choosing to commit murder, he was constructing elaborate rationalizations that allowed him to see himself as carrying out a cosmic plan. Randy began creating detailed plans for his attack, including diagrams of the store layout, identification of exit routes, and strategies for maximizing casualties, while ensuring that he could complete his suicide before police arrived. These plans were documented in digital files that he shared online in the days before his attack. He also created what he called his final animation, a cartoon depicting his EGS characters attacking a high school and killing students and staff. This animation served as both a rehearsal for his real-world attack and a way of immortalizing his violence within his fantasy universe. The level of planning and documentation Randy completed demonstrates that his attack was not an impulsive act driven by temporary mental breakdown, but a calculated decision that he worked toward for months while maintaining the outward appearance of normal functioning. On June 7th, 2017, Randy arrived for his night shift at the Weiss supermarket carrying 2 shotguns and wearing a t-shirt with the phrase, "It's our time to rise," a slogan associated with the Columbine shooters. He had spent the previous evening creating a reconnaissance video of the store, identifying potential escape routes and optimal positions for his planned attack. Before beginning his shift, Randy blocked emergency exits with his car and wooden pallets, ensuring that his co-workers would have limited options for escape when the violence began. He then proceeded with normal work tasks for over an hour, stocking shelves and completing routine duties while waiting for the optimal moment to begin his attack. At 12:10 a.m., Randy posted links to his suicide notes and attack plans on social media, providing a digital record of his motivations and mental state. He then armed himself with his shotguns and began systematically hunting his co-workers throughout the store. The attack lasted only minutes, but resulted in the deaths of 3 innocent people who had done nothing to harm Randy and had no involvement in his psychological problems or creative frustrations. Victoria Brong, Brian Hayes, and Terry Sterling died because Randy had decided that his fantasy world was more important than their lives. One co-worker, Kristen Newell, survived because she was wearing headphones and didn't initially hear the gunfire. When she realized what was happening, she was able to reach the staff room and call 911, though by then Randy had already completed his murders and killed himself. Victoria Brong was 25 years old and worked as an assistant department manager at the store. She was known for her caring nature and dedication to helping both customers and co-workers. Victoria left behind a young son, a partner, and a family who loved her deeply. Brian Hayes was a 47-year-old US Navy veteran who worked as night shift supervisor. He was a devoted husband and father who had served his country with honor and was working to provide for his family. Brian's military service and work ethic made him a respected figure among his colleagues. Terry Sterling was 63 years old and approaching retirement after years of dedicated service to the store and its customers. He was described as a kind, reliable man who left behind children and grandchildren who cherished their memories of him. These 3 people died not because of anything they had done wrong, but because they happened to be working the night shift when Randy decided to act out his violent fantasies. Their deaths represent the ultimate cost of untreated mental illness combined with access to weapons and a cultural environment that failed to take warning signs seriously. Randy's case is unique in the extensive digital documentation he created about his psychological deterioration and violent intentions. His YouTube videos, social media posts, file uploads, and recorded confessions provide an unprecedented window into the mind of someone planning mass murder. This digital evidence reveals that Randy's attack was not a sudden breakdown or impulsive act of violence, but the culmination of years of psychological deterioration that was extensively documented and shared online. Multiple people were aware of his disturbing content and concerning behaviour, but no one took action to report him to mental health authorities or law enforcement. The failure to act on Randy's warning signs represents a broader social problem with recognising and responding to threats of violence, particularly when they come from individuals who seem harmless or are dismissed as just weird, rather than genuinely dangerous. Randy's case demonstrates how social media and online platforms can serve as echo chambers that reinforce delusional thinking rather than challenging it. Instead of receiving reality checks about his bizarre beliefs and violent fantasies, Randy found online communities that normalized his thinking and even encouraged his creative expressions of violence. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of Randy's case is how preventable the tragedy appears in retrospect. The warning signs were extensive, well documented, and available for anyone to discover and report to appropriate authorities. Randy's online content included explicit discussions of suicide and murder, detailed plans for violence, weapons training videos, and philosophical justifications for killing innocent people. This material was not hidden or coded. It was openly available on public platforms where concerned viewers could have reported it to mental health crisis services or law enforcement. Several factors contributed to the failure to prevent Randy's attack. Mental health stigma prevented Randy from seeking treatment for his obvious psychological problems, while also making his family and community reluctant to address his concerning behaviour directly. The fragmented nature of online platforms meant that no single person saw the complete picture of Randy's deterioration, even though the individual pieces were visible to different audiences across multiple websites. Cultural attitudes that dismiss animated content and fan fiction as harmless prevented people from recognizing that Randy's violent fantasies were actually serious threats rather than creative expression. The tendency to avoid confrontation or getting involved in other people's problems meant that concerned observers failed to report Randy's behavior to authorities who might have intervened. Randy Stair's case raises important questions about mental health treatment, online radicalization, and the responsibility of communities to respond to warning signs of violence. His psychological deterioration followed patterns that are common among mass shooters: social isolation, grievance-based thinking, identification with previous attackers, extensive planning, and the creation of manifestos or recordings explaining their motivations. But Randy's case is unusual in the extent to which his entire process was documented and shared online, providing researchers and prevention specialists with detailed information about how someone can progress from social awkwardness to homicidal violence over several years. The case highlights the need for better integration between mental health services and online monitoring systems, as many of Randy's most concerning statements were made on social media platforms that have no connection to traditional mental health resources. It also demonstrates the importance of teaching people to recognize and report warning signs of violence, particularly when they appear in online context where the threats might seem less real or immediate than face-to-face interactions. The deaths of Victoria Brong, Brian Hayes, and Terry Sterling cannot be undone, but their memory can be honoured by using Randy Stair's case as a learning opportunity to prevent similar tragedies in the future. Mental health education needs to include information about the warning signs of violence and the importance of reporting concerning behaviour to appropriate authorities. Friends, family members, and online communities need to understand that expressions of violent fantasy should be taken seriously rather than dismissed as harmless creative expression. Online platforms need better systems for identifying and responding to content that suggests someone is planning violence against themselves or others. The technology exists to detect concerning patterns in user behaviour, but it needs to be coupled with human intervention systems that can provide appropriate support and intervention. Communities need to reduce stigma around mental health treatment, while also creating clear pathways for people to report concerning behaviour without fear of overreacting or causing unnecessary trouble for someone who might be harmless. Most importantly, we need to recognise that preventing violence requires collective action from multiple people and systems working together. No single person or intervention can address all the factors that contribute to someone like Randy Stair becoming dangerous, but coordinated community response can identify and interrupt the process before it leads to tragedy. While Randy Stair's mental illness helps explain his actions, it does not excuse the deliberate choice to murder 3 innocent people. His extensive planning, detailed documentation, and careful preparation demonstrate that he retained the capacity to understand right from wrong and chose violence despite having other options available to him. Randy's case serves as a reminder that mental health problems, no matter how severe, do not automatically lead to violence. Millions of people struggle with depression, social anxiety, obsessive thinking, and even delusional beliefs without harming others. The decision to commit murder represents a moral failure that goes beyond psychological illness. The 3 people who died at the Vice supermarket were simply trying to earn a living and support their families. They deserved to go home safely after their shift, not to become casualties in someone else's psychological war against reality. Their families and friends continue to live with the consequences of Randy's decision to prioritize his fantasies over human life. The community of Eaton Township was forever changed by a few minutes of violence that reflected years of deteriorating mental health that was never adequately addressed. Randy Stair's story is ultimately a cautionary tale about the importance of early intervention, community vigilance, and the recognition that online behaviour can have deadly real-world consequences. The warning signs were there for anyone willing to see them, but it took a tragedy to make people understand how seriously they should have been taken. The memory of Victoria Brong, Brian Hayes, and Terry Sterling should inspire us to do better at recognising and responding to the Randy Stairs among us before their delusions become our tragedies.